So this video is going to look and focus on thematic analysis and also compare with grounded theory as well. Now this is predominantly focused for your paper 3, for your issues and debates paper, particularly the research methods section. Now, thematic analysis we have covered before within the learning approach as well, and we also touched upon it within the social approach because thematic analysis is a way of dealing with qualitative data. So if you've done a big interview with somebody and you've got hours and hours and hours of transcripts and information and their opinions of things, you might look at that information and think, right, what do I do with this now? How do I analyse it? And the answer more often than not is thematic analysis. Now, thematic analysis is a way that we code or we change qualitative data into quantitative data to make it more manageable. Now, to do that, what you might do is you might go through all of the qualitative information and you might identify patterns and themes that are emerging within the responses from the interview. And you will identify this through a coding system. Once you've identified throughout the common themes or the consistent themes throughout what's being said, is you might then go back to the transcript and you might decipher how many times that each theme has occurred and therefore create a tally chart from that. And obviously a tally chart is using numbers, numerical data, because you can use the frequency at the end, which therefore means that you've managed to change your qualitative data into quantitative data. Now, it's really important though that you remember here that in order for this to be able to take place, the researcher has to be really familiar with the data in the first place in order to be able to identify the themes. So they must understand exactly what it is that that person was trying to say in their response in order to be able to identify the themes that suit the particular research question. Now, thematic analysis will basically take place by, as we've just said, familiarising yourself with the data. Once you've done that, once you understand, that's when you start to generate the codes and look for the themes within the codes. So for example, you might say, right, well, I've just done an interview with somebody about what their thoughts on obedience are, and I can see throughout that one of the common themes that they're talking about is authority figures. What you might do is once you've then deciphered that theme, is you will review that theme and you will say, right, what exactly does that mean? What does authority figures mean? And you might say things like any reference to some sort of status, authority, power, uniform. Say you were doing it with a school student, so you'd done an interview with a school student about their perceptions of obedience and they were consistently referring to a teacher. You might classify a teacher as an authority figure within that theme. Now, once you've reviewed the themes, you will then go back through the report and you will start to see how many times those themes occur. And once you can see how many times those themes occur, then you can tally how often they occur, and Bob's your uncle, there's your quantitative data. Now, Braun and Clark in 2006 suggested that the stages for carrying out thematic analysis should just be familiarise yourself with the data, generate the codes, and build and review the themes. And it's quite interesting to know that because don't forget, if you get an 8 marker, for example, on thematic analysis or the use of thematic analysis within research, we need to be able to refer to research and research suggesting how it should be done and then also the usefulness of thematic analysis. So an example was Lim et al. In 2014. Now they used thematic analysis within schizophrenia. Now the first thing that they did is familiarise themselves with the data and obviously coded the themes. And their particular focus in this situation was on implementing an individual placement and support programme in order to be able to see its effectiveness for the people that had schizophrenia and were being used in the programme. Now what they did is the themes were identified, and that was things like how the programme was run, differences between the programmes and the control group. And at the end of that, thanks to the use of thematic analysis, they were able to suggest this need for discussion in order to be able to focus on the best practice to support people who are working within schizophrenia. Now, obviously, LIM isn't a key study, so you don't need to know all of this. But again, like I said a second ago, if you've got an essay on thematic analysis, you do need to be able to give an example of where thematic analysis has been used within clinical psychology, which is the example you've been given here regarding schizophrenia. Now, strengths of thematic analysis, because again, if we're thinking about an essay, it's quite possible that your command word within that essay will be evaluate. Now, thematic analysis is a flexible way of analysing qualitative data because it can be done using categories and themes that come from the theory, or it can be used to generate those themes from data directly. Now, thematic analysis therefore doesn't need a theory to drive the analysis, unlike grounded theory, and I'll explain that in a second. So it's not driven by a theory, but it also doesn't need to derive a theory either, so it can do either, so it's interesting for us. It's a way of maintaining the richness in the data, so it keeps that validity within the qualitative information, but it also allows us to manage it and to deal with it in a manageable way. So for example, we haven't just got 10 pages of transcript from whatever somebody said from an interview. We're actually able to use those 10 pages of transcripts to help us to inform our report. It therefore allows us to have insights that aren't anticipated by the researcher and can present correct and detailed data in a way that doesn't lose its richness. So like I said, often when you're transferring qualitative data into quantitative, you lose a lot of the richness in the information. Whereas thematic analysis, because of that generation of themes, allows us to keep that and keep the meaning behind what we're doing. Now, participants can be collaborators. So by that, what I mean is they can verify the data once it's been analysed to maintain its richness. So you might say to them, right, I've analysed this big paragraph that you said about authority figures, and I'm saying that you're saying obedience is stronger when you've got somebody within the school who's got a position of power telling you what to do. And then the participant might be able to say, yeah, that's what I meant, or no, that's not what I meant. And therefore, again, it helps us to maintain that validity and that richness within the data. Now, weaknesses of thematic analysis. The first one is it's really difficult to say how the analysis is done in terms of general terms. So Eli et al., for example, in 1997, which was cited in Braun and Clark, said that it's thinking about the data and creating the links that gives them the themes. And it's not necessarily that they don't live in the data, they don't reside in the data. It's the researcher thinking about the data that actually creates the themes. Now, if the data comes from a questionnaire or an interview, they can also they come from questions put toward the participants, and that is often the case, and often when thematic analysis is used. But it can be really difficult to find themes in the data that aren't driven by the questions. So, for example, if you're asking a question about obedience, for example, it can be very difficult to ask a school student a question about obedience without referring to a teacher or an authority figure or somebody within status. So often what happens is the theme that you've generated, which is about the authority figure, kind of came from the question that you asked them. Therefore, you saying that a student's perception of obedience is that you only obey authority figures kind of came from you in the question that you asked, and therefore it becomes particularly subjective and loses that validity within the research. Now, because of that, thematic analysis can therefore be said to have a lot of subjectivity, because those analysing the data are the ones making the judgments about what makes the data form into a theme. And without guidance on how much data about an idea there must be for it to generate a theme, or how many times it has to be found there for it to become a theme, it therefore just relies on judgment of where there is judgment and where that theme is happening. And therefore we can say that thematic analysis is really, really highly subjective. And obviously we know that in order to prove that psychology is a science, we need to prove that psychology is objective and that there isn't bias within the data. However, it is worth noticing and noting that you can reduce this level of subjectivity if you've got more than one researcher analysing the data, because obviously they've got to have an inter-rater reliability. They've got to have an agreement across the raters, across the researchers, about what actually the information is given and what themes should be derived from it. Okay, moving on now very quickly to just look at grounded theory. Now, grounded theory is almost the opposite of thematic analysis. It's very, very similar in the way that it's done, but what's interesting with grounding theory is that it doesn't use an existing theory. So, for example, you're not testing or seeing whether students are saying that authority will affect obedience, which you might say comes from agency theory, from Milgram. What you're doing with grounding theory is that you're finding a theory from the data. So you would use grounded theory to go and investigate something like obedience, and then you would analyse the findings from your interview or questionnaire, and then you would use those findings to then determine what the theory needs to happen from that. So you might say, right, I spoke to students about authority, about obedience, sorry, and factors that they think affect obedience within a school. And actually, I found that a lot of the students commented on what time break was, because on a Wednesday break time's earlier so that they felt more obedient. From that information, you might then generate a psychological theory about how time affects obedience within children. So you didn't go into that research testing time, you found that time was a recurrent theme throughout the student responses, and therefore you use that information to inform a theory. Now that is exactly what grounded theory does. Now again, kind of comes with a bit of a warning here, because again, obviously it's not scientific. So again, science, think about your hypothetico-deductive model, is about taking a hypothesis, testing that, amending it based on your results, and then testing it again. In this situation, we're obviously not doing this. We're getting the information and then we're creating the theory from it. So obviously grounded theory then focuses in a very different direction than thematic analysis, because we're looking at the data first and then arriving at the theory. Glaser and Strauss used an example of this. They put forward the idea of grounded theory in the 60s, and they said the aim of the theory is to retain the richness of the ideas and the interaction between the people within that qualitative data. So how does grounded theory work? Well, it's actually no different than thematic analysis at this point. So again, think about a comparison question. The actual way that they're implemented is very similar. So we do the coding, we take small pieces of text, we work out what the ideas of each text is, we then create those codes into concepts or themes, as we've just said a minute ago, and then we go back to the data and we look at those themes. Now, grounded theory, there is a lot of validity that happens within the coding, because if the coding is done carefully, using meaning from the data in chunks, then the codes are developed into wider concepts, going backwards and forwards from the codes to the concepts in order to build the concepts. Now, this means that participants' own thoughts and feelings are actually used to drive the analysis, which means that the concept should measure what they claim to measure, and therefore we can say that it's got validity. Grounded theory uses specific terms to explain how it is done and how explicit it is in its guidance, which, when it comes to deriving theory from qualitative data, is not done in any other way. Thematic analysis can analyse qualitative data, and content analysis can also analyse qualitative data and give it into categories. But it's actually grounded theory that goes on to develop a theory then to explain the data. So grounded theory allows that creativity that's needed to move from data to people, and therefore drawn up ideas that actually explain that data. Now, another strength that grounded theory allows the richness and detail of the qualitative data to survive that analysis. So the concepts that come from the coding bring the richness of the data to the analysis rather than losing that detail. However, it is perhaps impossible to code and categorise into concepts without some theory in mind. So Thomas and James suggest that we cannot put out of mind theories when analysing qualitative data, and it could be argued that it isn't appropriate to ignore previous research in order to aim to generate a completely new model or theory from this data. The original question is likely to have come from previous data in the first place, and therefore previous findings, and therefore previous theory, which is basically saying that it's almost impossible to do grounded theory because you can't go into something with a totally clean slate mind. You've always got a perception or an idea yourself about, for example, what different things would influence obedience. Now, engaged theory is a totally different idea, and this focuses on concepts from data, as does grounded theory, but engaged theory uses existing theory to help within the analysis. It's not possible, perhaps, to generalise the findings of a study using grounded theory to say that any theory comes from that data can explain all examples of what's being understood, because the data itself, for example, that you've gathered will come from a specific culture in a specific time frame using specific participants. So it's very difficult to therefore generate theory from one piece of research, and because of that, it's very, very difficult to generalise from grounded theory. There's just a summary table on the board. I suggest you pause and just have a quick look at this in case you get a comparison or a compare question. Please remember that compare within your exam means similarities and differences all the time. Now you can see on the board here the similarities. They're both using qualitative data, they're both using codes, they're both using themes, they can both be seen to be objective, they're both keeping the subjective, they're both keeping the richness of the detail, they can both be enhanced by additional researchers, and they're both highly unscientific. However, don't forget that massive difference is that grounded theory derives or creates a theory from the results, whereas thematic analysis is usually testing a pre-existing theory. Grounded theory can therefore be said to be less valid and more subjective than thematic analysis. And thematic analysis can be seen as then slightly more scientific because it is technically testing a hypothesis, whereas obviously grounded theory isn't. Because it isn't following that hypothetico-deductive model that we mentioned, so it isn't testing pre-existing research and therefore going back and making changes from it. I hope that helps.